Some things are really self-explanatory. He said he was a KU fan. And then you expect him to read? Or understand things like numbers or proportions? No, it doesn't happen, bro. Nice guy. KU. No. Hi, I'm Bill Todd. I'm one of the pastors on the Christian Formation team, and I'm really glad to be here with you tonight for Community Live. This is always a highlight event, as many times as we do this during the year, because it's the time we get to come together and do some really great things as a church and as folks that have come to visit the church just to check things out. One of the great things we get to do together at Community Life Services is we get to observe communion together. And I'm going to try something that I'm not sure has been done in this auditorium before. I'm going to try to connect the story of a really minor character in the Old Testament to communion. I don't know how successful I'll be with this, but I'm going to give it a shot. And it really reflects more on a trip that we just got back from. A group of us got to go over to Holland and to England for 10 days. We just got back on Sunday. It was a tremendous trip. And Peter's going to tell you more about it in just a few moments, but I just want to share a little bit about my experience with it. One particular experience specifically. I'm a geek. I don't know if you've noticed that with our times we've talked together. And so I like arcane stuff in the Bible. And I have a favorite book. And it's one of the books that gets jumped over in almost every study. And I've never heard a sermon preached out of it. And I think I'm the only one that teaches any kind of lessons out of it. It's this really minor book called Hosea, Hosea. And it's stuck way back in those parts of the Old Testament that everybody skips over because really they're very hard to understand. But I've always liked this particular book because, number one, I think that it proves my belief that God functions with sarcasm. At one point, he tells people that don't like him to go ahead and worship your sacred raisin cakes. And so I believe that shows God has a slightly sarcastic sense of humor. But the other part about it is the picture that it paints. Old Testament prophets, or really prophets of any age, really got a bad deal. You'd think it'd be great to be picked by God to do a specific thing, but almost every time their jobs were enormously hard, and they came at tremendous cost. And Hosea was no different. The way I'd understood his life up to this point recently was that he was an upright guy, a God-fearing guy, and tried to do the right thing. And God had a job for him. He said, I want you to go marry a woman, and I'm going to let you know something ahead of time. She's going to be unfaithful. But that's your job. You're to marry her. In fact, and every time she's unfaithful, your job is to go back and get her. And not just get her, but bring her back home. And not just get her and bring her back home, but restore her to a place in your heart and in the community as though she had never been unfaithful to you ever. That's your job. Congratulations. And I always loved that book because I thought that it was such a great object lesson. You know, Hosea represents God, faithful, and his wife represents the unfaithfulness of God's people. And I thought I understood it. I was challenged this summer. One of my heroes showed up, a guy named Brandon Manning, and I got to drive him around. And during one of our car rides, he challenged me to read a Jewish philosopher. And so when one of your heroes encouraged you to read something, I tend to read it. And so I've been reading this guy's writings, particularly on the prophets. And this guy has a different take on Hosea. And his thought is that often we do look at Hosea like I looked at Hosea, as kind of an object lesson. Here, I'm going to use this guy's life, and it's going to be a word picture that's going to teach you something about the relationship between God and people. But this author, this Jewish author, Heschel, says, no, that's you missed the point. He says that assumes a couple things about God. That, number one, assumes God will waste somebody's life. That God would take somebody's life and waste it by turning it into a simple object lesson, into a kind of a cardboard cutout of what a life could or should be. So that's not how God operates. That doesn't reflect God's compassion. It doesn't reflect his love and his respect for the people he created. That can't be right. And he said it also just really undermines the complexity of people. You know, to reduce people's life or their experiences to an object lesson is really something that we might do to each other, but it's not something that God would do to people, particularly people that he loves. And what Heschel put forth is a slightly different idea. He said that, that he really does, you know, it seems true that God really did say to Hosea, I have a job for you, and your job is to marry this woman, and she's going to be unfaithful to you, but this is the job I need you to do. Heschel's contention is that what Hosea really believed was that his uprightness, his faith, his honor would be enough to change her. That Hosea really believed that his relationship with God would be so powerful that it would eventually change his wife and she would no longer be unfaithful. And that when later in his life he found out that his 3 children were in fact not his children at all, that it wasn't like, oh, yes, this is the pious lesson that God is teaching me. That he, like any person, any man, was devastated because he really thought that his uprightness would be enough to change her, and yet, in fact, it wasn't. Heschel's contention is that it wasn't that God used Hosea's life to teach a lesson. It's that in the living of life and in the disappointment of that life, that Hosea learned something about how God feels. That God really does know that he's good enough and he should be enough to change us, that his uprightness and his faithfulness and his patience and his endurance and his grace should be enough to change us. But too often it's not. I had reread that chapter on Hosea probably a dozen times by the time I got to England. I read it one more time last Wednesday morning. And I kind of feel like I got it. I finally got a grip on it. Oh, yeah, that's not at all like I thought it was going to be. Well, Wednesday we had a great day with some new friends in England. Again, Peter's going to tell you about that. But one of the highlights was we got to go to a noontime service at a beautiful church called St. Martin's. And this service is put on by some folks there, and they just call it Sanctuary, and that's all it is. It's just a way to create some space in the middle of the workday, in the middle of a very busy business, urban shopping area. And we had a beautiful service, very simple, very sincere. And at the end of the service, at the end of the 30 minutes, we had a couple of options. We could go take communion, or there was another place over on the side where you could light a candle and pray. And I chose to go over and light a couple of candles and pray for a couple of folks I know here at Woodcrest that are battling some major health issues. And that was my whole intent. But as I sat there and I was thinking about kind of the processing I'd been doing through Hosea and then the whole experience of the trip and then praying for these folks, I kind of came to another realization. I'm not audible. I don't have those weird, goofy God moments that some people have, but I just kind of had this nudge inside me because I was sitting there thinking about some difficulties that I've had over the past few years, particularly in relationships, in one relationship in particular and how it's played out over the course of both my professional and personal life. And I think we all have had seasons like this. This is not an uncommon experience where at certain times you feel like there's a block somehow, like you're not being heard or you're not being understood or your contribution is not being validated or appreciated by people that you really want to. And sometimes it happens in the workplace. Sometimes it happens in a relationship. I don't think it's uncommon, but it doesn't mean it's any easier. And it doesn't mean it hurts any less. And it doesn't mean you feel any less stifled by the inability to feel like you're being heard, to feel like you can communicate clearly, to feel like you're being understood. And sitting there on the bench in St. Martin's, I kind of had this nudge inside of my spirit, and it was really profound, and it sounded like this. It's hard, isn't it? It's hard, isn't it? I think, I can't swear, but I think that might have been God speaking to me. And I think what he was trying to communicate